On the morning of July 28, 1540, the most powerful man in England walked to a scaffold on Tower Hill. By noon, his king was at a wedding. The same sun rose over both events. The same king ordered both, and somewhere in that fact lies a mirror no history textbook ever held up to you. Welcome to Epochal. Today we investigate the single most revealing day in the court of Henry VIII and the chain of events that made it possible. To understand July 28, you have to go back further to a painting, because this story begins not with a sword but with a brush. It is 1539. Henry VIII is 47 years old. He has been married 3 times. Jane Seymour, his third wife and the mother of his only son, died 2 years earlier. He needs a 4th wife. His advisors need him to need one, and Thomas Cromwell, the man who runs England from behind the throne, has a plan. Cromwell's plan, a Protestant alliance sealed through marriage. The candidate Anne, daughter of the Duke of Cleves, a principality on the Rhine in what is now Germany. There is one problem. Henry has never met Anne of Cleves. He is famously vain about beauty, so Cromwell commissions a portrait from the greatest court painter in Europe. Hans Holbein the Younger travels to Cleves in the summer of 1539. He paints Anne, and that painting, historians document, will set off a chain reaction that ends on a scaffold. The Holbein portrait of Anne of Cleves shows a serene, dignified woman in an elaborate jeweled headdress. Henry sees it and approves the match. Cromwell breathes. The alliance is set. Anne of Cleves sets sail for England in December 1539. She arrives at Deal Castle in Kent on the 27th, and the court waits. Henry, however, cannot wait. Henry rides to Rochester to surprise her, a romantic gesture, the kind he had made before. He enters her chamber in disguise on New Year's Day, 1540. The meeting, by all documented accounts, is a disaster. He had imagined the portrait. She had imagined the protocol. Neither matched the reality. Henry leaves Rochester unmoved that night. He tells his attendants he is not pleased. Cromwell hears the report. He knows what it means. He had staked his political survival on this match. An unhappy king is not just a problem, it is a sentence being written in invisible ink. The wedding goes ahead regardless. On January 6, 1540, Henry VIII marries Anne of Cleves at Greenwich Palace. The court celebrates. Henry does not. The marriage is not consummated. The sources from that period document uncertainty about why. But both Henry and Anne made separate statements to that effect to their physicians and attendants. 6 months. That is how long Anne of Cleves is Queen of England. 6 months, during which the entire court watches, whispers, and calculates. And while the Queen navigates a court whose language, literally and politically, she barely speaks, a different story is accelerating in the shadows. Thomas Cromwell had enemies. In a court like Hampton Court, that was unavoidable. But Cromwell had more than most, because Cromwell had more power than most. Chief among his enemies, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk despised Cromwell's low birth, the son of a blacksmith who had climbed to the right hand of the king. Norfolk and his allies saw their moment in the failed royal marriage. Every whisper they planted reached Henry through the natural channels of court gossip, officially attributed to no one. Simultaneously, the king's attention had shifted to one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, a teenager named Catherine Howard, niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk had placed her deliberately. This was a calculated move, a niece positioned as a weapon in the very household of a Queen Norfolk intended to destroy. By April 1540, Cromwell received one of the highest honors of his career. Henry named him Earl of Essex. At the very peak of his power, the trap was closing. The elevation to Earl of Essex on April 12th was celebrated in court. What no one said out loud: kings sometimes honor men they have already decided to remove. Through May and into June, the whispering campaign against Cromwell intensified. Norfolk and his allies brought charges of treason, sacramentarianism, and corruption to the king's ear. There was no trial. That is the detail historians return to. A bill of attainder, a parliamentary instrument declaring someone guilty without any judicial proceeding, was used instead. No jury, no verdict read aloud, no defense given. Cromwell's name appears on the attainder, but there is no trial transcript because there was no trial to transcribe. On June 10, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested at a council meeting at Westminster. He was taken immediately to the Tower of London. The councillors who had worked beside him said nothing. From the Tower, Cromwell wrote to Henry. The letter survives. It is a plea not for innocence, which would have been futile, but for mercy. He calls himself the king's most loyal servant. Henry did not reply. He was already focused elsewhere on the annulment of his marriage to Anne, and on his 5th wedding. Cromwell's letter was received. It was ignored. And now we come to Anne of Cleves, because while Cromwell was in the Tower, Anne was facing her own moment of decision, and she made a choice that no one expected. Henry's advisors approached Anne in late June with a proposition. Agree to the annulment of the marriage, cooperate fully, make no claims. They expected a fight. Anne did not fight. She agreed quickly and completely, but here's what she negotiated in return. 4 houses, a generous annual income, and precedence over every woman in England except a future queen. She also retained what historians document as a friendly relationship with Henry for the rest of his reign. She was invited to court. She was given gifts. She had become something extraordinary, a former queen who had survived. The annulment was granted on July 9, 1540. Anne was no longer queen, and across London in the Tower, Thomas Cromwell was counting his remaining days. 19 days. That is how long passed between Anne's annulment on July 9th and the execution on July 28th, 19 days during which Henry planned his 5th wedding. Now we need to talk about Hampton Court itself, because you cannot understand the court of Henry VIII without understanding the physical space that made it work. By 1540, Hampton Court was the most sophisticated palace in England. Henry had completed its building program. It was a machine designed not just for living but for power. As many as 1,000 courtiers and their servants would crowd into Hampton Court at once. 1,000 people, all orbiting the same center of gravity, the king. Access to the king was not a matter of desire. It was a matter of architecture. The palace was built as a series of rooms, each guarded, each requiring higher rank to enter. The outer rooms teemed with hundreds, the middle rooms held dozens. The innermost rooms, the privy chamber, the bedchamber, were accessible to a handful, and the king himself might be beyond even those. Your clothing told the guards which rooms you could enter. Your title told the household officers whether you could speak to the king directly. At Hampton Court, your rank was your passport. Over the walls of Hampton Court hung more than 2,000 tapestries, not decoration communication. Each depicted a story the king wanted his courtiers to read and internalize. 2,000 tapestries. That number staggers the modern mind. Historic royal palaces documents it. It was a palace that spoke even when the king was silent. Food was another currency. The kitchens at Hampton Court produced meals on a scale that would astonish even a modern catering operation, thousands of portions daily for the court's hierarchy. Banquets were not parties. They were performances of power. Every seating arrangement a calculated statement. Every dish offered to the king before anyone else. Every gesture rehearsed. To survive the court of Henry VIII in 1540 required a very specific set of skills. Not bravery, not brilliance. Those could get you killed. What you needed was a talent for reading the room. Thomas Cromwell had that skill once. He had survived and thrived under the most dangerous man in England for a decade. But in 1540, he misread the room and misread the king. Between his arrest on June 10th and his execution on July 28th, 48 days passed. 48 days in the Tower, no response from the king, no visitors of note. The silence of the court can be louder than a verdict. And then we arrive, July 28th, 1540, the day that contains 2 events so different in character, so close in time, that the only way to make sense of them is to feel them in sequence. Before dawn, the preparations at Tower Hill have already begun. The scaffold has been built. The executioner is present. A small crowd of observers is gathering in the early gray light. Cromwell is brought from the Tower. He is 54 or 55 years old. His exact birth year is uncertain. He walks. He does not require assistance. By the accounts of those present, he is composed. At the scaffold, Cromwell gave a speech. He acknowledged the king's justice, as was expected of condemned men. He asked those present to pray for him. Then he knelt. The execution of Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, took place on the morning of July 28, 1540. The man who had dissolved more than 800 monasteries, rewritten England's governance, and served the king for a decade was gone. His enemies, Norfolk, Gardiner, and their allies had won. And the instrument they used was not a battlefield, not a court of law, not a duel. It was whispers, timed perfectly. And now, the same day, hours later, across London, at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, a wedding is in preparation. Henry VIII is marrying Catherine Howard, his fifth wife. The same sun that rose over Tower Hill now fell on a wedding party. The same king who had ordered the execution now exchanged vows. History records no pause between the two. Catherine Howard was, by most historical estimates, somewhere between 16 and 21 years old. She was vivacious, popular at court, and entirely unprepared for what the position of queen would demand of her. She would not survive her marriage either. Within 18 months, Catherine Howard would follow a path toward the Tower, but that is another story, and it belongs to another year. Today belongs to July 28, 1540, and to the question that hangs in the air after you learn what we have just told you. How does a man go from the highest office in England to a scaffold in 48 days? And what does that speed tell us about the nature of power itself? The answer starts with what Cromwell understood and what he missed. He understood the machinery of the state better than almost anyone. What he missed was simpler and more human. He missed that the king's feelings about his marriage, a marriage Cromwell had arranged, were not a policy problem he could manage. They were a personal grievance that was going to need a person to blame. Cromwell had given Henry a queen he didn't want. Norfolk gave Henry a way out and a scapegoat. In the court of Henry VIII, the man who offered the solution outlived the man who created the problem. Now let's return to the portrait. Because the Holbein painting of Anne of Cleves is not just a historical object. It is the pivot point of everything that happened in 1540. Hans Holbein was the premier court painter of the age, trusted to capture likeness with precision. His previous portraits of Tudor figures are still considered among the most accurate representations we have. When Cromwell commissioned the portrait of Anne, he was not asking for flattery, or if he was, historians do not confirm it. What the painting shows is a dignified, composed woman. And Henry said yes. The portrait did its job. It secured Henry's approval. It brought Anne to England. And then reality met expectation, and the gap between them required someone to pay the price. That price was paid by Thomas Cromwell. But here is what is important to understand. The portrait was not a lie that Cromwell told. It was a gap that his enemies exploited. In the Tudor court, the gap between perception and reality was not a philosophical problem. It was a weaponizable asset. Norfolk saw it, he used it. Cromwell didn't see it coming until it was too late. Anne of Cleves, meanwhile, understood something that Cromwell did not. She understood that in this court, the most dangerous move was to fight from a position of weakness. She did not appeal to Henry's emotions. She did not contest the annulment. She negotiated quickly, clearly, and from a position that seemed to offer Henry exactly what he wanted, a clean exit. And in giving Henry the clean exit, Anne extracted maximum value, 4 properties, a generous annual income. Status above every other woman except a future queen. She had turned a crisis into an estate. Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family, was among the properties granted to Anne of Cleves. The irony of that location was not lost on the court. Anne of Cleves, the German princess sent home in apparent failure, now owned one of the most storied properties in English history. The court's most celebrated beauty had lost her head in that same story. Anne of Cleves outlived Henry VIII, who died in 1547. She outlived Catherine Howard, executed in 1542. She outlived Edward VI. She died in 1557, the last surviving wife of Henry VIII. She was queen for 6 months. She left the court with her life, her income, her properties, and her dignity intact. The woman the court had dismissed as a diplomatic failure had played the longest game. Now let us step back from the individual stories, because July 28, 1540, execution at dawn, wedding by noon is more than a dramatic coincidence. It is a document. It documents what power actually does when it has no external check. It documents how quickly a system discards the individuals inside it when they become inconvenient. Cromwell spent a decade reshaping England, dissolved the monasteries, rewrote the machinery of governance, built the king's treasure, and in 48 days he was gone, with no trial to mark the transition. The Bill of Attainder that condemned Cromwell required no evidence presented at trial because there was no trial. Parliament passed it. Henry signed it. That was the entire process. This is the detail that should stop you. In the system, Cromwell himself had helped to build the administrative state of Tudor England. There was a mechanism to remove anyone without proving anything. He had used it himself against others. That fact does not make his end just, but it does make it comprehensible. Power teaches the lessons it wants to teach, and usually too late. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry closed more than 800 monasteries across England. This was Cromwell's program, the dissolution of the monasteries, and it transferred enormous wealth to the crown. The wealth of those monasteries funded the palaces, the tapestries, the banquets, the armies. The court of 1540 that we have been describing was built in significant part on the dissolution Cromwell carried out. And so by 1540, Cromwell stood in a palace his policies had funded, serving a king his loyalty had sustained, only to discover that neither the palace nor the king owed him anything in return. There is a pattern here that extends far beyond Tudor England. The court, any institution, any power structure runs on the same underlying logic. Proximity to power is not the same as security. Usefulness is not the same as safety. The person who solves the king's problem today may be the problem the king needs to solve tomorrow. Anne of Cleves understood something that Cromwell did not, or understood it too late. When the system moves against you, the question is not whether to fight. The question is, what do you actually need to survive? She needed income. She needed status. She needed her life. She did not need the title. She did not need to win. She needed to exit the fire with enough left to build something of her own. And she did. For 17 more years after the annulment, Anne of Cleves lived as a wealthy, independent woman of high status in England. She was visited by royalty. She maintained her own household. She was not forgotten. She outlived them all: Henry, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, Edward VI. Even Mary the I would die before Anne. The woman who seemed to lose everything in 1540 had in fact secured everything that mattered. Now let us hold all of this together for a moment. The portrait, the wedding, the execution, the annulment, the 500 rooms of Hampton Court, the 1,000 courtiers, the 2,000 tapestries. What does it actually feel like to live inside a system like that? To wake up every morning inside a palace where your position is never guaranteed, where a whisper can end your career, and where the man at the center answers to no one. Historic royal palaces documents that up to 1,000 courtiers and servants crammed into Hampton Court at once. 1,000 people performing their loyalty daily, in person, in competition with each other. Every day in that palace was an audition, not for a role in a play, for continued existence inside the most powerful political machine in England. Miss a cue, and the consequences were real. And yet, they came. Every courtier in that palace, every lord and lady and secretary and steward, they chose to be there. Because proximity to power, even dangerous power, was the only game in town. The court was not a trap they fell into. It was a system they entered voluntarily, understanding the risks, because the alternative, irrelevance, felt worse than danger. Sound familiar? The names have changed. The palace is a different building. The stakes are lower, hopefully. But the underlying architecture of power, proximity, and survival is still running the same operating system. Every workplace has a version of the privy chamber, the inner circle where real decisions are made. Every organization has a version of the whispering campaign. Every institution has a version of the Bill of Attainder. The question Anne of Cleves answered, and Cromwell did not, is one worth sitting with. When the system turns, what do you actually own that no king, no board, no algorithm can take away? Cromwell owned the king's trust, until he didn't. He owned his office until it was revoked. What he built was built inside a system that could be turned against him with a piece of paper. Anne owned something different. She owned her judgment about what she actually needed. She owned her ability to negotiate from inside a crisis. She owned 17 more years of her own life. 1540 is 5 centuries behind us, but the people inside it were navigating something very modern. A world where the rules are set by someone else, where loyalty is not a guarantee of safety, and where the exit strategy matters as much as the entry. Thomas Cromwell entered 1540 as the second most powerful person in England. He left it before summer was over, from a scaffold at dawn. His name is in the record. His voice is not. Anne of Cleves entered 1540 as a stranger in an English court she barely understood. She left it 18 months later as a wealthy, independent woman who would outlive the entire cast of this story. And Hans Holbein? He continued as Henry's court painter until his death in 1543, likely from the plague. The portrait that triggered a political earthquake did not trouble his career. Art, it seems, was not held responsible for what kings chose to see in it. Hampton Court still stands. You can visit it today, walk through the rooms, each one requiring you to move deeper into the palace's logic, stand in the great hall under the hammer-beam ceiling, feel the geometry of 1,000 people orbiting one man. The tapestries are mostly gone, dispersed over 5 centuries, but the rooms remain, and in the rooms the logic of access and rank and proximity is still legible in the architecture itself. Stand there long enough, and you begin to understand that the people who lived in these rooms were not exotic creatures from another time. They were people making decisions under pressure, just like you. Some of those decisions bought them time. Some bought them estates. Some bought them a scaffold at dawn. The court had no mercy for the wrong decision and no memory for the right ones. We began this story on Tower Hill at dawn on July 28, 1540. We ended somewhere quieter, at Anne of Cleves' window, looking out over 17 years of life that no one at court expected her to have. She kept what she built. She built what she could keep. There is an entire philosophy of survival in those 2 sentences, one that didn't require a court, a king, or a scaffold to prove itself. The court of Henry VIII in 1540 is not a story about another time. It is a story about what systems do to people and what people, at their most clear-eyed, can do in return. If this investigation moved you, if you found yourself somewhere inside these rooms, hit like and subscribe to Epochal. We decode the stories that built our world, and we're just getting started. Tell us in the comments. If you had been at that court in 1540, which would you have chosen? Cromwell's ambition or Anne's exit? There is no right answer, only the one you could live with. One morning in July 1540, a man was beheaded at dawn, and a king was married by noon. The sun rose over both. The Thames carried both reflections, and somewhere in the distance, a woman was counting her new properties. That is the court of Henry VIII in 1540, a machine that ran on loyalty, ran on fear, ran on spectacle, and sometimes, just sometimes, ran on the quiet intelligence of someone who knew when to walk away. This is Epochal. We will see you in the next investigation.